So I work very much as part of almost an academic environment up in Cambridge, and it's important to get, for me to kind of clarify which part of Microsoft I come from exactly. There is a research division within Microsoft that's about 1,000 people worldwide. And a lot of those people come from academia and join Microsoft and are lucky enough to kind of pursue their themes and interests without too much interference from product development groups. So I'm going to cover some ideas and just themes that the team that I'm part of is particularly interested in. But you shouldn't walk away from it thinking this is Microsoft's plan, or there's a business group interested in this, or whatever. In Cambridge, we're left a little bit to ourselves, and so we take the opportunity to pass things over to Seattle when we can. But a lot of these ideas are very much our own at the moment. So I work as part of a team in Cambridge that is actually led by sociologists and psychologists, which is a little bit odd generally for Microsoft. We tend to be a technology-led company. It's nice because actually a lot of our design work is driven ethnographically, which means we go into the field and visit people's homes and point cameras at them and see what they do, basically. And I think a lot of ethnography tends to try and find ways of finding the commonality between different homes. You visit lots of homes and see what you see recurring, and then that's the thing that you aim your idea at, or that's the thing that you aim your design at. And I think what I like about the team that I'm part of is that we like to look for the quirkiness in people's homes, and we like to kind of dig around and find the things that make each individual home unique to some extent, and see whether out of that uniqueness you can extrapolate any ideas that are kind of interesting. And I'm going to talk specifically about a theme that we're interested in called technology heirlooms, and it touches a lot on, I think, what the panel was just talking about, which is this sense of history in objects. My grandfather passed away a couple of years ago, and I inherited his suitcase full of black and white photos from the war. And it was just kind of, as a container, it was a beautiful object that was filled with all this rich kind of sense of history of a part of his life, somebody that I knew that I wasn't really aware of. I mean, he'd been he was a test pilot and a bomber pilot and had a very interesting war and very interesting career in the Royal Air Force. But it wasn't really a history that I was conscious of, and he was very modest about it. But it was interesting that it wasn't until later in his life that he started to kind of revisit some of his content. So this is him now taking these photos and turning them over. And actually at this point, he struggled to see, and he needed my mum's aid. And so this is actually my mother's handwriting here, going back and kind of rethinking and contemplating on, well, who was in this picture and where was I, and revisiting that. So there's a sense of kind of like the objectness of this photo. I mean, it's a beautiful item, and as an item, it stands in a particular period of history. The photo has these aesthetic qualities that are about the period during which it was taken, and the content itself has these period things as well. And it really gets you to thinking about, well, what's going to happen to all our digital stuff? So even when you think of photography in isolation, in some ways, analog photography was a restraint on content. The cost of film and the cost of processing and things meant that people kept their numbers of items that they had, not to a minimum, but to a manageable number. I had this suitcase, and it probably had, it was full of photo albums, so they're pretty kind of thick books. It probably had a couple of hundred photos in it, and I take 5,000 photos a year now. And I can't help thinking what a burden I'm passing on to my own family at the end of my life if I carry on doing that for the next 20 or 30 years and say, yep, here's the photos, kind of have at them. So there is a question, there's kind of an aesthetic question about, the quality of digital stuff versus physical stuff. And then there's also this kind of burdensomeness of digital stuff too, that through sites like Twitter and Flickr and Facebook and things like that, we're pushing content out all the time. And admittedly, it's quite ephemeral at the moment, really. It's not really fixed to a particular point in time, and we don't really think about its longevity. I don't think we really think about saving our Twitter feeds. I mean, some people do, but we're forming a history of ourselves that at some time is going to go on to somebody else. So I'm going to talk generally about this theme of kind of technology heirlooms and what it means to take technological things and digital things and kind of project them and think about them going through that process of heirlooming, which includes kind of preparing for your death, if you like. I've talked to a lot of people whose parents get to a certain age where they start walking them around their home and saying, well, what do you want? and having these really kind of strange, surreal discussions. And then also what happens after death, what is it about those objects, and also the relationship between people who inherit those objects and the people who originally had them. So I'm going to put in a few of these little sketches, and they're all just conceptual, and you know, they don't have a huge kind of a depth of meaning at all. But the idea here is that, well, what if you take the content of someone's PC and you can host it yourself on your machine? Is it enough to just take their photos and put them on your machine? Or is there something about the digital experience and the environment they spend time with digitally that you would want to host yourself, so that at some point you can revisit the virtual side of this person's lives and see what websites they spent time on, and those kinds of things? I think for us it's important to clarify the distinction between heirlooms that are sentimental in a historical sense, and heirlooms or objects that are sentimental for an aesthetic sense. Like I have one of these typewriters at home and love it as a beautiful object, and similarly I for some reason went out on eBay over a period of a couple of weeks and bought a range of these beautiful transistor 8 little pocket radios that are kind of like the iPods of their time, basically. And these were kind of aesthetic. They feel almost like heirlooms, but they're not actually locked in any particular time for me. They're objects that I bought that are historical. And I find the interesting thing about these objects is I wasn't alive when they were produced and when they were released, and yet aesthetically they have a sentimental value to me still, even though they weren't part of my own kind of personal history. So again, there's a question about, well, what about these digital things too? There is this sense that digital things that are released now are very much in the moment, and they go out of fashion quite quickly. But then they come back into fashion at some point as well, like the transistor radios that were their height of fashion at that time. They probably went through a period where they were, pretty nasty in the 50s or 60s, just after they were released, and then they came back as kind of sentimental historical objects. And so this is kind of like a little concept, which is just of a piece of very well-known technology that you'd buy that has a display built into it that basically from the moment you buy it, it starts counting down to the next Apple keynote, if you like. And then at that point, it's time to refresh this object. And at that point, it starts counting up again to let you know a point at which it's now fashionable for you to use that object again. And I have a Series 1 iPod in my office. It's the one with the rotary control that actually physically moves. And that object went through a really clunky period, where it felt like it was an inch or so thick, and suddenly it's returned a little bit as a thing of value and as a historical moment. Actually, there's something really nice about the physicality of the fact that rotary control really, really moves, and the edges are very, very sharp compared to the modern iPod. So there is this kind of transition that's kind of interesting. So yes, there is this kind of question of where we in Cambridge are most interested. At one end, there's the sentimental object that could include something that's an heirloom, or could include something that you just bought that you thought was beautiful and old. And at the other end are really heirlooms. There are things that were owned by people who were part of your history. And the older something gets, the less you knew that person, you didn't know them personally, for example, the more they become basically a piece of archaeology. And so there's this idea that I didn't know my great-great-great-grandparents, and so the objects that I look at that I know that they once owned, or photos of them, don't have as much personal sentimentality to me, and so I'm more objective about it. And suddenly I'm looking at this for the details that's almost what an archaeologist would look for, about the dates and about what was going on in history at that point, and more the context, if you like, than I do if it's somebody that I knew. Like my grandfather, I want to know what he was feeling, because I knew him as a personality. So we've done a bunch of these, a lot of ethnographic visits, and one of the things we've done is basically gone to people's homes and said, well, get the boxes out of your loft and empty them and tell us about the things that are in them. And it's interesting how subtle it is, the kind of relationships that people have with objects, and also this shot is a little bit about the sense of obligation. We've gone to a lot of people's homes in which we'll find in their boxes that they have a lot of things that belong to somebody who's passed away, but actually they don't really like the object at all. But they feel like there's a sense of obligation to keep this in memory of them. And that's kind of an important theme, is that this object has become an heirloom. It's no longer something they can part with unless they do it with a tremendous sense of guilt. They don't actually like it, so it goes in a box in the loft upstairs, because at least they've kept it, and at least they'll pull it out once ever so often in memory of this person. So in this case, this was a couple who'd adopted this boy, Ryan, and they had a box in the loft that was a combination of objects that he'd had with them as a baby, but also the objects that he'd arrived with when they'd adopted him. And so they felt an obligation to keep these objects that actually were given to him by his birth mother. And that was interesting, because who knows what Ryan will do with them at the point where they fulfilled their obligation and they pass them on to somebody else. And so I think that services like FreeCycle, if you know FreeCycle, it's basically a way of quickly getting, well, people respond pretty quickly, getting rid of your stuff for free. You send an email to FreeCycle and you say, I've got a couple of seats, they're a bit tatty, but they're not too bad. And then you get email back that says, I'll take them, and somebody drives to your house and picks them up. And I kind of use them quite heavily. But FreeCycle is an interesting service because there's no money that passes hands. And so to a certain extent, it feels like it's a service that allows you to alleviate some of your sense of guilt and some of your sense of obligation, because you feel like, well, this must be going to quite a good home, because this person, this person has gone to the trouble of picking it up and taking this object from me, and I haven't had any of the dirtiness of money changing hands. So here again is another kind of odd idea. The idea being that people, when they visit your home, can express an interest in things that in the future you might think of getting rid of, and that they'd adopt on your behalf. So here's this vase, and this person's received a little email or letter from their friend saying, well, if you ever think of getting rid of this vase, I'd be very interested. I'd give it a good home. This was another kind of interesting thing to come across. This is a guy who, one of his most treasured heirlooms is this gear, and it's from his first motorbike, and his first motorbike basically exploded and he had a crash on it, and he blames this gear, and as you can see, the teeth are kind of very, very worn away. So there is this question about, as a designer, whether you can even design for heirloomness or for this kind of sense of sentimentality, because some of these objects that people get really attached to aren't for an aesthetic value at all. They're purely because they're associated with a certain age. We wouldn't have expected to go into somebody's home and for them to say, well, actually, this gear, this knackered old gear, is really important to me. Similarly, there are different kinds of heirlooms. There's heirlooms that you keep and put on display. There are heirlooms you stick in boxes in the roof, and there are heirlooms that you carry on using. And so this ladle belonged to the I think great aunt of this lady that we visited, and she still hangs it on her oven and she uses it every day, but every time she uses it, it reminds her of memories she has of her great aunt in the kitchen. And so these kind of heirloomed objects can continue to have real meaning and real use in somebody's home, whilst carrying on that job of communicating a sense of memory and sentimentality. And similarly, this is a book of jams that's passed down through this family, and each subsequent member of the family ends up annotating it. And so I think this annotation is kind of about how incorrect this quantity of jam is, and how the recipe is actually a little bit messed up. And so, I mean, again, just to think about that a little bit randomly. Well, what about objects that that allow families to build a sense of history and to build a sense that they've passed on from one generation to another generation? And so we had this idea of objects that you could basically scribe into, almost like it was a classroom desk where you were leaving your name and your date and things, and kind of stating that your time was there. And these would still be technological objects, but over time they get a patina of kind of history of who owned them. It's odd to go around some of the old. I went around Eton College once on a tour, and you'd see these bits of graffiti that were kind of like, 1685, so and so was here. Sometimes the name was famous, and it's just, that kind of connection to history was really interesting. So another thing we thought a little bit about is collections of things, because quite often people spend a lot of time in their lives collecting a set of objects, and actually the process at the end of their lives of those objects going on to family members can be a really difficult one. So typically somebody will pass away, and then the children will get the job of coming to this house and deciding, well, who gets what, and where do things go, and what should we do about the house, and should we put it on the market? And these tremendously difficult questions. And so these things that people might have spent a long time collecting and kind of treasuring often get split up amongst family members. And so their goal of being a set of things that as a set are beautiful then kind of diminishes. And so there's a question about, when you're talking about the relationship between physical objects and virtual, about whether the virtual has a role to play there in continuing to link these physical objects together. You know, so your parent dies and their set of vases or something gets split amongst family members, but they still have a sense of togetherness online, and there's a place that you could visit that shows them as a set and gives their sense of history, when they were bought, and those kinds of things to bring them back together. I thought one interesting thing is, I have a daughter who's 3 years old, and my wife and I, when we were last in the States, we bought a copy of Sesame Street, and of course the important word on here is old school, and so this is kind of the first episode from the first 4 years of Sesame Street, and it got me thinking to a certain extent about sometimes how how possible it is now to buy yourself your sense of history. So this is a shot from eBay of vintage toys, and some of these people are doing it because they're collectors and because the item in and of itself has a certain value for them. And some of them I know, because I'm one of them, buy these objects in order to recreate the sense of an experience, a sense of a certain period for themselves or for somebody else. So there's a sense that sometimes with heirlooms, the objects themselves are the things that you want to pass on, and where the value and the sentimentality lies, but sometimes that the experiences themselves are actually far more important, and the objects are just a proxy, if you like. They could be any old object, and that's actually the way in which they help people re-experience certain events, certain times, certain people, certain places, and that kind of thing. And a good example here is place. This is from a Flickr set that I found of a workshop. I think it was called Grandpap's Workshop or something like that. And it was basically this person whose grandfather had passed away. And here was a space that they really associated their grandfather with, that he'd spent an awful lot of time in. And so it's almost like the experience of the place itself that matters. But again, there's that obligation after the end of a life to do something with that space, to have it, whether that's sell it or use it from some other purpose, which comes with a lot of sense of guilt and those kinds of things. So we've been playing. You might have seen used recently in the inauguration of Obama. I think CNN made a large deal out of it. But this is called photosynth, and basically what photosynth allows you to do is take a set of photos of a space. And then photosynth itself takes the job of overlapping those things and takes what are 2D objects and makes kind of very, very three-dimensional experiences out of them. So this is just a photosynth that somebody created out of 100 shots. The idea here is to use technologies like this to capture a sense of place. So you take lots of photos, and as you pointing in lots of different directions, and you really start to get a sense of capturing that place. You don't get the smells, you don't get the sounds, you don't get some of those elements, but these kinds of technologies allow you to drill in quite deeply into different spaces. So that idea of kind of using software as a way to capture a sense of place in a rich way that helps alleviate that sense of guilt. Is interesting. And similarly, this is another project that we've done out of Cambridge, which is called SenseCam, and it's basically a camera that you wear almost in your own perspective with a wireless, with a wide-angled lens, and it takes a shot every 30 seconds. And back to that, and I think it's interesting because this idea of kind of what we call life logging, which is a scary notion in of itself, is a little bit abstract. But you start to see some of that online. A lot of the things I read on Twitter, you're kind of like, why did somebody feel the need to express that moment in time and really kind of make a statement about it? There's the banal, from the banal to the kind of like highly personal. So these activities of kind of like logging your life on an ongoing basis, trying to write a blog a day, trying to put a Flickr photo up on Flickr once a day, try to tweet regularly, and those kinds of things, again, are something that somebody is going to have to deal with at some point if they want to retain them and retain a sense of you once you've passed away. So this is an example video. Hopefully the audio will run. Yeah. Can you hear the audio from there? I think it's just coming through the mic. So this is somebody who we deployed SenseCam with for a while, and he basically put together this kind of summary of some of the sets of photos and things that it had captured. And what I think is really interesting about it is that it really is a balance between the banal and the meaningful. That you have these moments where he's just kind of driving along in the car. You know, quite a lot of people that we deploy SenseCam with take the camera off and point it at themselves to get a sense of context and things. And then you have kids playing, you have them flying a kite, and these kinds of things that you can imagine are moments that are maybe more important or more treasured, or at least for them. But this is a camera that takes a shot every 30 seconds. I mean, I don't know the mathematics of exactly how many shots that is a day if you did it, non-stop. I like this. They tie the SenseCam onto the kite and kind of send it up, and then you get this sense of time. You know, they just stick it in a window, and then you get a sense of light and space and clouds and motion and things like that. So I think it's kind of an interesting activity, and as I say, it's an activity that to some extent feels like it's already going on online. But somebody else is going to have to deal with all of this content once you've passed away. I thought it was worth putting the Feltran annual report in. If you don't know this is a guy who every year does an annual report on himself and delivers these kind of meticulous statistics about how long he spent in a plane. And I think this was, I can't remember half of these things. Most frequent lunch spot was Olives. 25.5 burgers, 67 slices of pizza. You know, this kind of like this is life logging taken to the nth degree. But there is this sense that capturing a lot of this data is becoming easier and easier. But again, in the future, that probably means that your whoever follows you has got a lot more content to kind of deal with. There's another interesting site which is My Wonderful Life, and this is a site that basically allows you to prepare for your funeral. And this is another interesting thing that I think you hit a lot in this space, is the sense that you're no longer in control once you pass away, which is a very obvious thing to say, but a lot of people are fighting for a sense of having the representation of themselves that they wish to have after they've passed away, rather than a third-hand representation even from close family members. So this is kind of interesting service that theoretically is supposed to give you some of that sense of control and allow you to dictate the terms of your funeral and the way in which things happen at the end of your life. It got me thinking a little bit about kind of solicitors and the process of, the formal process as we have it now, of willing things on to other people, and whether there's a role to play, whether you could see the solicitor almost as providing a service of being the mediator between you and whoever is going to be the inheritor. So a little idea here is that as I said, towards the end of the lives, a lot of people start thinking about where their things would go. Well, what if the lawyer was the person who held these digital objects, one of which was for each person who was an inheritor? As you went, you put the digital things that meant most to each of them in these little things. And after you'd gone, once they actually came to reading the will, you got given this object that contained the things that somebody went to the trouble to select for you, and selected with you in mind. It's kind of another interesting site, which is Footnote, and this is it's odd because it's primarily a historical site, but it allows you to put your own personal stories in context. So it's another place that you can go to memorialize people who have passed away and say, well, my grandfather had a role in this particular thing, or my grandmother lived here at this time, and here's some facts and things. So it's a way of building up. It's a way of building up a history around a person that is in the broader context of what else was going on at the time. And I've actually been going through, and some of us have been doing this as well, for themselves and for family members, going through the process of trying to create a timeline. And it's odd how, for me, for my grandfather, when I'm creating his timeline, all of these dates and things are tied around the World War, where for that whole generation it was such a massively impactful event. And for me, it's kind of like when the exciting things happen. And of course, he's passed away now, so I have no way of really kind of talking to him about, well, what about the 25 years after which after your retirement? What about the 25 years after you'd retired from flying, but you were doing air traffic control and things like that? These moments that were kind of less significant for him, probably much more highly personal, as grandkids came and went and that kind of thing. This is an interesting service in Japan using QR codes, which are these 2D barcodes that store, in the same way as a regular one-dimensional barcode, they store a little bit more data, and so you can now buy a monument to somebody who's died with a QR code on it that ties it back to media online and the story of this person beforehand. And again, that story, because this is tied to a monument, the person who made this decision to buy this thing is not the person who passed away. And so the story that they've chosen to tell online is not necessarily the one that they themselves would have told about themselves. It's one that's kind of already editorialized and filtered through a particular lens. One interesting thing about this monument is it has locked doors in all of the pictures. So you actually close these little doors over the QR code and you lock them. And I have no idea whether that means, just the family members have access to the key, or just that when you come to this place, you have to go and ask for the key from the person who runs it. Partially, I wanted to stick this in because you don't often have a slide that says death in it. But I think it's interesting to think about this transition, of this digital content. We're getting past the point where it's all about, where digital photos are just the things for particular generations. We're kind of well past that point, and we're starting to enter a point where we have to think more deeply about what it means for a lot of this both physical and virtual content to become the property of somebody else and to be representative of a person after they've passed on. Thanks very much.